racist bigots. When they watch videos of the 1950s Birmingham, they write in the comments, oh, the area was good until the immigrants arrived, meaning the Pakistanis and the West Indians. But that is false. Cryptocurrency, people invest. People have invested £60,000, £100,000, and those who are profiting, when they pull out, what happens? The value of the cryptocurrency goes down, and they never regain their investment. So that's a fake economy. Islam would not advocate the building of a nuclear bomb. And that shocks so many Pakistanis.
Assalamu alaikum everyone. With me I have none other than Shaykh Asrar Rashid, the lion of Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah, I think you are famously known as. And for me, I think the big thing that I remember you for is that poison. You know, that we're going to talk about that, Shaykh. But also, Shaykh, you've written books. We've got these books here. Khizr from my team, he got these signed by you, mashallah. Islam, Answers, Atheism, Shaykh Asrar Rashid, and then we've got Navigating the End of Time. So mashallah, Shaykh, you've written books. You've studied. I think you spent some time in Damascus, right?
Yes.
Mashallah, and you study and you teach these days in Birmingham.
Yes, in Birmingham, yeah.
Alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah.
Institute, yeah.
And then I've seen on YouTube, I don't think anyone can have missed them if they've been watching Islamic videos, your debates with various different people. And I think for me, honestly, the single standout moment of I think the last 12 to 18 months of me watching YouTube was when you drank that poison. I thought that was just a drop the mic moment.
I would love to know actually if you can drink that poison. Because remember guys what Muhammad says, just drink the poison, get a date, it should help you.
That's right, it says that.
Okay, date, can someone go and get a date? And also can someone check if it is poison or not?
Right, I think we should leave that there.
Well, in reality, Hatun Tash should have drank that poison. It would have benefited her immensely. But instead, I drank the poison and had a few incidents with the stomach. But
really?
Alhamdulillah, I'm okay.
Alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah. No, I think it's brilliant. What got you into this whole debating thing at the start?
Interlocuting with Christians and Salafis.
Yeah.
So in the 90s, we were bombarded with Christian missionaries in these areas, and then also Salafi missionaries. And they would enter the masjid and ask us, where is Allah? Why do you place your hands like this in prayer? And that led to the whole your mind being assaulted at a young age with such type of questions led me to study the deen of Allah and then being able to provide answers.
It's an interesting one, isn't it? Because I grew up as a Hanafi, I guess I still am a Hanafi, and you grew up getting taught that your hands are here and there's a certain way of being, and you're right. I think there was that wave where suddenly you have the Ahlul Hadith, if you want to think of it that way.
They say Ahle Hadith.
Ahle Hadith. People who are like very focused on the nusus and almost like much more of a arguably literalist reading of certain hadith, and of course now that I've studied a bit more, and of course Shaykh, you've studied, you understand that there's much more to life.
So later when I went to Syria, I studied with the Shaykh Nuruddin Itr, his book I'lamul Anam, which is a commentary on Bulugh al-Maram of Al-Hafiz ibn Hajar, and he covers all four schools and he gives the adilla, the proof for each school, and you realize how broad the Sunni tradition is, where placing the hands whether below or above the navel is a non-issue, Raf al-Yadayn is a non-issue. So even in 2016 when I had the debate with Abdurrahman Hassan, in the pre-debate discussion, some of my friends, they went with me and purposefully they were praying by doing Raf al-Yadayn, which shocked Imran bin Mansour and his cohorts, that how can people accompanying Shaykh Asrar be doing Raf al-Yadayn? That's because we do not deem Raf al-Yadayn as a major issue. So within our company, there's people who follow all four madhabs, meaning people who follow the Hanbali school, people who follow the Maliki school, the Shafi'i school, the Hanafi school. Even though the majority of us are Hanafi, there are people within our circles of knowledge who follow the other schools, and there is no issue with that.
Absolutely.
So the real issue wasn't why you pray with the hands below the navel or above the navel. There are a few creedal issues which are the core issues, which are the actual difference.
And Sheikh, what was this debate on? Was it on these kind of issues?
And so that debate with Abdurrahman was on at-tawassul wal-istighatha.
Right, okay.
With the
Right,
Prophet
right.
sallallahu alaihi wasallam.
Yeah.
So he deems al-istighatha with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam as a shirkul akbar.
Right, I see.
Major polytheism.
I see.
Meaning it takes the person out of the fold of Islam. But the problem with that premise is that you would have to take out so many ulama from the history of Islam out the fold of Islam who advocated istighatha bin Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It's a clear violation of some of the nusus of the companions alayhim ridwan who did do istighatha bin Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam after he passed away. And thirdly, it has its roots in the Taymiyan paradigm of differentiation of Tawheed, making categorization of Tawheed, Rububiyyah and Uluhiyyah. So by making that distinction of Uluhiyyah and Rububiyyah, what that entails is that Muslims today can have Tawheed Rububiyyah, but they violate Tawheed Uluhiyyah, which takes them out of the fold of Islam. When the standard Ash'ari Sunni position is, the definition of shirk is very simple. If you at-ta'addud fi dhawat, you multiplicity of entities of gods, or ascribing God's divine attributes to a makhluk, or God's divine actions to makhluk. So if someone doesn't fall into that, they do not fall into shirk. So those ulama who advocated istighatha, they did not advocate multiple gods. They did not advocate the attributes of Allah being given to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and they did not advocate the divine actions of Allah being ascribed to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So the position would have to go down a notch or two notches. From a shirkul akbar, Abdurrahman should have advocated something else, like a fiqh position. What's his fiqh position? If he had advocated a fiqh position, then the debate may have not even ensued. So some ulama, for instance, Zainuddin al-Iraqi, he says, rahimahullah, that al-istighatha bil awliya is not allowed, it's not permitted, but he says that as a fiqh position. But then the majority of the Shafi'i ulama, they contradict him. So all those majority Shafi'i ulama who say istighatha bil awliya is permitted, we do not deem them as being mushrikeen, polytheists. This would lead to declaring a large number of the ummah of the Prophet ﷺ as polytheists. So that was the backdrop of the debate. Many young people at the time, they may not have understood the nuances of the debate, but now as they grow up with time, they will realize the weakness of such a position and the after effects in terms of how that position actually violates principles of logic and principles of usuluddin and whatnot.
And Sheikh, you've grown up in Birmingham for I think much of your life, right?
Yes, born and bred, yeah.
Born and bred, mashallah. How has, and obviously we're a finance channel, but I'd love to hear how was life growing up in Birmingham, and also how have you found the evolution of things like money and economics and social well-being as you've grown up over the last few years in the Muslim community?
So Birmingham, it was capital of industry. So growing up, the road I grew up on was the road where Joseph Priestley had his laboratory, and his laboratory and home were burnt down in 1791 by Christian rioters because he was a Unitarian Christian who advocated supposedly the French Revolution. He supported the French Revolution. So these were monarchists burning down his laboratory. And that is a historical moment in Birmingham history. Where the laboratory they burnt down was the place where he discovered oxygen and where laughing gas was discovered. So laughing gas, 200 years later, is a drug for youngsters that they take now in balloons, but many of them would not know that the site of the discovery of laughing gas was Priestley Road or Long Street, where I grew up, where Joseph Priestley was based. That was farmland in those times. Up the road, you have Lloyd's Bank. So the Lloyd's family settled in Farm Park, and the Lloyd's family lived in my area. So Spark Brook was owned by the Lloyds Bank banking family. And the entire surrounding area was farming land owned by a banking family. So we grew up in that area, but many of us wouldn't have known that basic history. Or in the 1980s and 1990s, Long Street Park, near where I grew up, there was a statue of Thomas Atwood, political campaigner from the 1800s, the first MP for Birmingham, or one of the first MPs from this area. So a historical area, Matthew Boulton, and the discovery of the steam engine,
Wow.
Joseph Chamberlain. So that's the backdrop of us immigrants coming into, my grandfather being the immigrant, but some people still maintain an immigrant mentality. But arriving firstly in the early 1900s, you had the Yemeni community settling in Bosalit from the late 1800s. There was Sheikh Qasim, who was a Sufi. He was a deputy of a Sheikh Alawi, a Darqawi from Algeria, and he settled in Bosalit and he opened a Sufi Zawiya in Bosalit. So this was your first wave of immigrants. And then my grandfather arrived in the 1950s with all the Kashmiri migrants who entered into Birmingham, Bradford, Yorkshire, all the mills.
Post-World Wars.
Post-World War, and he was also stationed with the British Army in Burma. So he fought in Burma, and after being stationed in Burma, then he came to Birmingham. So growing up in this area, as a child, I would see the Rotunda building in town. You would be able to see the Rotunda from my home in Birmingham. Now it's covered with buildings, but that's telling you about capitalism. So we're growing up in these areas, in the heartland of Western capitalism. Birmingham is major in Western capitalism. You have British Small Arms, BSA. So everyone knows it as BSA Park, but what they will not know, BSA was the place where ammunitions were made to kill Africans.
Wow.
So the Western man would make his ammunitions here in Birmingham and then export these ammunitions to the British Army across the world to kill Indians in India, or what they refer to as Indians, to kill people in Bengal, to people in Punjab, people in Africa. All of those arms were exported from Birmingham.
Wow.
And then during World War II, just before we arrived, just before our families arrived, when Hitler attempted to bomb various parts of United Kingdom, he obviously targeted Birmingham and Coventry. But when he threw his bombs on Birmingham, he was targeting the BSA factory, the British Small Arms factory.
Right, I see.
And a gust of wind blew the bombs away, and the bombs landed on residential homes in Smallheath. So Smallheath was bombed away. So that's the history of the area before our arrival. So we come into this industrial capital of the Western world, a major arm of Western capitalism, a major appendage, and then we help in building up the city. So many bigots today, racist bigots, when they watch videos of the 1950s Birmingham, they write in the comments, oh, the area was good until the immigrants arrived, meaning the Pakistanis and the West Indians. But that is false, because when our people arrived, the white working class, the white British working class, they had no good housing standards. The council housing that we have now, that didn't exist until the government, post-World War II government of Attlee. And that government only introduced housing and the NHS because of political pressure, not because of some goodwill. It's because of, in the past history, a lack of housing or a high taxation always led to revolution. So the people were not as dormant as they are today. Today people are dormant. We're being taxed. Inflation. We face all of this, but no one is protesting. No one is causing a revolution. There are reasons for that. But when King Charles II and King Charles I, every Charles has been controversial. Now we have Charles III, but King Charles I and King Charles II, when taxes were introduced, it led to revolution. Meaning there was the beer tax, They even had the window tax. They even had bedroom tax. They even had the Napoleon tax. They even had the Salahuddin tax. So all these taxations within Britain have been going on since the Doomsday Book, and the Doomsday Book was written in post 1066. Britain has been taxed till the day of judgment. But when our first wave of immigrants arrived, they rebuilt the city. They contributed to industry. They contributed, but they were cheap labor. So because they were cheap labor, the people employed them, and the whites that were living in this area were actually Irish. They were not English.
I see. So they were also migrants.
They were migrants from the potato famine. So the potato famine in 1846, from that time, you had Irish migrants moving into Britain. Their descendants today will think they are white English. So they live in Hall Green and Solihull and all these areas, and they think they are English. In reality, if they go and check their ancestry, they would be Irish. And then you had the white flight, where white people left these areas, and a whole wave of West Indian and Pakistani and Bengali people settled in these areas. So that's the enviro that people like myself and yourself would have been born.
Yeah.
And then we become confused at birth because we're multilingual.
Yeah.
So as soon as you're born, your parents are speaking one language, your school is speaking another language. You go to madrasa and you read Quran in Arabic. But it has its benefits, because then you become trilingual. And then growing up in that environment, the people tend to have an immigrant mentality in the sense of economic gain, that our purpose of life is only economic gain. And this is a negative mentality, but not as negative as the opposite mentality, which is the mentality of the younger generation, that when they need a cup of coffee, they ring a coffee shop from home, and the cup of coffee will cost £10 or £20, when the elder generation would have taught us and instructed us, you just buy a jar of coffee for £3 and you can make 100 cups of coffee.
Yeah.
So economically more viable, the elder generation were, and they were able to buy a few homes around the inner city areas.
And Shaykh, have you found that as the generations have passed, that Muslims have changed in terms of going from quote unquote working class to middle class? Is that happening, or what's the trend that you're seeing in Birmingham?
Well, I prefer the old Mirpuri Kashmiri working class people, because they had better etiquette. And for instance, you're my guest, you've come from London. When you after we finish this podcast, it's my job to host you with food.
Oh, exactly.
But the new generation, they go to a shop together. I will ring you for a meal, and we'll go out for a meal, and then I will expect you to foot your own bill. The old generation never had this. If I ring you for a meal, then I'm the one who will pay. Or you come to my house, you'll be hosted with tea and coffee, but tea and coffee is useless before food. They say in Arabic, الشاي على الجوع كضربة على الكوع. Drinking tea on an empty belly is like being smacked on the elbow. So the old generation had values. If someone arrived at their home, they hosted them. That stinginess with time, that stinginess with wealth was not there. So these are good qualities that the old generation had, that the new generation must retain, because these are qualities of Islam.
Yeah.
That generosity, hospitality. So I believe those qualities are being lost with some of the new generation, who become quote unquote coconuts, that their skin may be, I know political correctness would be against that term, but I'm from Sparkbrook, we use those terms. If someone has brown skin on the outward, and then inwardly he wants to maintain a kafir way of life, a kafir way of life would entail a selfish way of life. But our elder generation, they had community, a sense of cohesiveness.
And what's causing that, Shaykh? Because I get that, I see that as well, and arguably, I can't speak for you, but me and people like us are in that generation. I look at my parents, I think they're better people than me. How can we fix that? How you
fix that is firstly by the principles of Al-Islam. Al-Islam is our way of life. So everything is instructed to us by Al-Islam, the Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but also accompanying those elder people who had good akhlaq. This doesn't mean that it was a utopia. I'm not advocating that the elder generation were free from faults. They had some qualities that we should not lose. We should retain those good qualities, and from those qualities, because we're discussing economy, was hospitality. So someone is your neighbor. If you remember the 1980s, when your mother would make food, they would fill a container with that food and they would say, go and give it out to the neighbors. So you would not give it to one neighbor, you'd give it out to a few neighbors. And how trends change with time. The white people at that time would say, your house smells of curry. And then now curry is the national dish of the UK. So trends change with time. Today, you have an Indian Prime Minister. Tomorrow, you may have a Muslim
and
king.
Downing Street probably smells of curry at this point.
Yes, and tomorrow you may have a Muslim king also. Inshallah.
Inshallah. You heard it here first, folks. Maybe we already do, Shaykh.
No, we judge on the outward. So if someone is a kafir on the outward, we say he's a kafir. If he adopts Islam openly, we declare him a Muslim.
Accept him. So Shaykh, I wanted to get into capitalism and your research around the Islamic economy, Islamic Khilafah, and how all this fits together. But before we do that, I want to ask you, do you invest? What do you put your money? How do you think about your own money, your relationship to money?
Well, I'll give you a summary of my relationship with money. I'm not very good with money in the sense that if you gave me £100 to invest, I may not be so good at investing that money. But there are basic guidelines that everyone should know through Al-Islam, by which they will know how to safeguard their money and have barakah in their money. There is a difference. Barakah is having blessings in the money. And this is a concept that many Muslims have moved away from. So even if someone, their threshold of wealth is less, there will be more barakah in their money. For instance, a man may go home in the evening and he has meat for food, expensive food, but he's not satisfied. His belly is not full, or he may have a stomach problem afterwards. He doesn't save any money. He only has enough money just for that food. There's a lack of barakah in his money. But there may be another person who is earning money. When he earns the money, he buys lentils. He eats lentils. He's very satisfied with the lentils, and he has savings left over. He can spend the money on other things. There's barakah in the money. When does barakah enter your wealth? Barakah enters your wealth when the money is halal. That is the first principle. That today we have Muslim capitalists, people who live a capitalist way of life, that they look at profiteering before halal. They abuse other human beings in order to attain the money. So many businessmen, I deal with their problems here in the masjid. They will lie in order to attain money. They will make false promises. They may steal money, but there will be no barakah in their money. They may sometimes invest in a business and the business fails, and the real reason for the business failing is because they were not honest in the first place. They do not make contracts. So the longest verse in the Quran is regarding trade. The longest verse in Al-Quran al-Kareem is regarding trade. They do not make contracts. They do not have witnesses for those contracts, and then they dispute afterwards. So these are basic principles by which I live by. Another principle of that is, if you do invest, never invest more than 1/3 of your savings. So what will people do? They take out bank loans, interest-based loans. They take money from other people. The business venture fails, then they are covered in what? Debt. They drown in debt.
That's interesting, Shaykh. Is that you're deriving that from some nusus, or that's just a principle?
Some of these are from the nusus of the Quran and Sunnah. Others are guidelines given to me by ulama. So some of the ulama, they said to me, if you ever invest in a business, never invest more than 1/3 of your savings. So if you have your own personal savings, 1/3 of those savings, and never invest if you don't have the capital. So if you don't have the strength to invest, don't invest.
Brilliant. That's really fascinating. So Shaykh, that makes a lot of sense. So you've laid the groundwork on how you think about personal finance. But what about the economy as a whole? You're working on a book right now on, I think, the Islamic Khilafah as a whole, right? How does finance have a role to play in that, and economics, and where does that fit into that big picture?
So the economic monster that we have today, previous to that we had an economic organism, meaning the caliphate was an organism, an organic system of economy. Currently what we have is an economic monster. This economic monster goes against the natural order of economy. So the natural order that we have is, for instance, a man, he grows his vegetables and he sells the vegetables in the markets, and then he gains money for that. That is a natural economy. So if there's availability of vegetables, the person will sell the vegetables and then gain money. That's in accordance with what the ground is producing in terms of natural vegetables. But today what we have is not a natural economy, we have a fake economy, in the sense that a person will not only have the vegetables, there will be so many hands involved in between those vegetables reaching the marketplace, and that there is a fake economy in between. So when the natural order of an economy is not with the natural order of money, there is an imbalance in the economy. But capitalism doesn't recognize that imbalance. What capitalism does is boom for a while, and a while could be 70 years. So when you have construction in a certain area, people think, oh, there's so much construction, the economy is booming. Yes, it's booming, but later the bust will come because the economy is fake, meaning people were happy when Birmingham city centre was being constructed in the post-2003 war in Iraq. Of course, the money was coming from the oil in Iraq and the plundering of Iraq. But the economy may boom for a short while, but it's not based on the natural order of money and natural order of economy. In the sense, what do I mean by natural order of economy? The natural resources and the natural order of dealings that people have. And what do I mean by natural order of money? That the money is in accordance with the natural economy. If there's an imbalance of this, you have modern capitalism. So a fake economy. And then, yes, people are profiteering.
What does that mean, Sheikh? When you say, can you give us a sketch of fake economy or like what does that mean in your...
An example of that would be, today you have this digital currency. Cryptocurrency. Now, 7-8 years ago, when people asked me about cryptocurrency, I said it's a scam. And at that time, people said regarding me, he's naive, he doesn't understand economy. I said, it's better for you to invest in gold. 7 years later now, people are admitting that I was correct with regard to that. Why? Because what I saw was a similarity between cryptocurrency and the pyramid schemes. In the 1980s and 1990s, they had pyramid schemes. People at the top benefited for a short period of time, and then the entire system collapsed. That is what has happened now with cryptocurrency. Cryptocurrency, people invest. People have invested £60,000, £100,000, and those who are profiteering, when they pull out, what happens? The value of the cryptocurrency goes down, and they never regain their investment. So that's a fake economy. That's an example of not a real economy. It's not real wealth. Real wealth is actual resources, where a person has real resources, not fake resources. So that's where we enter the domain of the modern currency, how currency is just printed by what we refer to as fiat money, by government, by banks, the Bank of England, and then how they play with the interest rate. So the interest rate was raised now for the 12th time.
Yeah.
Why is the interest rate being raised? Most people will not even understand why the interest rate is being raised. And similarly with the treasury in the USA, how the treasury post 1913 can print money at will. So that's a fake economy. It's not real economy. The order that was prevalent in the world prior to that was what the order of what real money, gold money. and where people had gold and silver, which was real currency, and that real currency was measured in accordance with the real world economy, which was real resources, real labor, even labor, if we can labor as a resource, real labor as opposed to what we have today.
Very interesting. So your view on fiat currency as a whole is effectively the same analysis as what you said for cryptocurrency, right? Because in fiat currency, it's the same thing really, that the people who control the faucet at the top, they're the ones who
it's just running on confidence.
Yeah.
So the legal ruling, the fiqh ruling of fiat currency would be the following. In fiqh, you have an example of wine turning into vinegar. Yes? So while it remains wine, it's wine, but it potentially can turn into vinegar. So fiat currency is similar. It's running at the moment. It's functioning because of agreements amongst governments, Bretton Woods and post-Bretton Woods. So they all agree on the US dollar, and they all deal with their own currencies. And then the floating currencies that we have in the world today and the market, they can exchange those currencies, but there is always potential for the money to collapse. So like wine can turn into vinegar, fiat currency can collapse at any time because it's running on confidence. It doesn't have actual inherent value, unlike gold and silver. So in the Pakistani economy example, when Pakistan was formed.
But then, Sheikh, I would push back on that and say that, look, if we look into gold and silver, isn't it the same thing where you've got this £10 coin and it's imbued with value that human beings have associated with it? In and of itself, it's obviously intrinsically worthless. And arguably, you could say the same thing for gold. It's in and of itself, sure, actually gold has some uses, but in and of itself, the vast majority of the value ascribed to gold is just because we like it.
So that if you go to the periodic table of elements, for instance, the periodic table of elements, you look at each element and you value the element on certain attributes, viability, how long, longevity, how long the material lasts, and you will conclude with which metal, gold. So it wouldn't be paper. So the table of elements. So if you go back to the table of elements and we say, okay, we have a currency, we need a currency. In the old times, they used cowrie shells, different types of currencies. Which element will we go by? You measure each element. If you do a correct examination, you will conclude with gold. So from the table of elements, gold is still at the top.
Yeah.
So,
but again, I would say I'd push back on that and say that, look, Sheikh, I completely get that it's stable, it's easy to store, it's not reactive, all of that stuff, and so as a choice of things that we could go for on the periodic table definitely makes sense. But the point is that the value it gets is not because it's got those attributes in and of itself. The point is that the value it gets is because we like it.
Yes, so there would be two responses to that. One response would be what I mentioned with regard to the natural order of economy. Unlike paper money, we can print paper money at will, which leads to inflation and then deflation. With gold, it goes with the natural order of economy because gold is mined at a rate where inflation rarely happens. So when the conquistadors went to South America, they arrived back into Europe with a large amount of gold, which led to inflation. But even then, the inflation is not like the type of inflation we had with paper money. So it's the least probable of having what inflation, the type of inflation that we see with paper money.
Sorry for interrupting. This is really interesting because I've been thinking about this a lot myself, and I get the argument that what we're doing is we're saying instead of money being created as something from a printing press or from a government, instead we're shifting it to a place where it's not as proliferous. It's hard to control it in terms of it, coming into existence. But the question I have is then, is that actually a good idea? Like we're saying instead of the Bank of England doing it, we're going to switch it to Ghanaian miners and to countries who are rich in gold. And I have two questions with that. One is, fundamentally, is that a good idea? And is that fair? And secondly, my question is that, and I was discussing with some of my friends in the city, and their point was that, look, when we decoupled from the gold,
1920
Bretton Woods, I think it was then, and then also later on when, I think it was the 1960s or 70s, when there was like a full-on decoupling.
1971.
Yeah.
So there was the people in the city.
Yeah.
They would be against what I'm saying.
Of course. But I think the argument is interesting, which is that they say that since then you see this huge explosion of growth, and part of that is only possible when you decouple from gold. Now, and I've not really come to a final conclusion on it, but I do see the value of both of those arguments. But I'm interested to hear your thoughts.
So you've got 1925, Winston Churchill reintroduced pegging the British pound with gold. That failed. So in 1931, that was removed. It failed. But why did it fail? It's not because of gold. It failed because of a post-World War I Britain could not cope with going back to the original value with gold. There are other reasons for that. And then John Maynard Keynes was one of the opposition to Churchill with regard to pegging the British pound on gold. He wrote an entire article on that. You find it in the collected works of John Maynard Keynes. And then Keynes was one of the advocates of the Bretton Woods Agreement. But Keynes was not in total agreement with the US in terms of the US being the standard for every other currency. Yeah. And then the US dollar was pegged with gold.
Yeah.
Then you have...
I think he proposed like a new currency entirely. I think he proposed something called the Bancor, which is this like global currency that he wanted.
Yes, because Keynes was British, so he would want Britain's hegemony on the entire in the world, because Britain was facing a post-British Empire world. So and the rise of America, basically. So then you had 1970 and 1971, where Nixon unpegged the US dollar. And then from 1971 until today, 2023, this growth that they discuss, this is what I refer to as the fake economy. And then, but what they will not mention is debt. How much has debt increased?
Massively.
Since 1971.
Yeah.
So that disproves the point. Additionally, how many crashes have we had? Meaning from Black Thursdays and Black Wednesdays and Black Mondays, I don't know how many, 1988, and when Alan Greenspan became the head of the Treasury, and all these facts that you find in literature. And then additionally, the recessions, the number of recessions, the disparity between rich and poor. So yes, there is profiteering going on, but who is profiteering? 1% of the Western population, or 1% of the world's population. Where is the profiteering, the distribution of wealth for the entire world, or for the poor of the world? So then you look at the ownership of corporations and ownership of natural resources throughout the world, the majority of it in the hands of a minority. So the people in the city, and London city means the 1 mile square, they will be against what I am saying, because what I am advocating is what Islam advocates what?
Sure.
Distribution of wealth. So in Islam there is profiteering, but there is no marginal gap, a huge gap between the rich and poor.
This is a really very, very interesting. So what they would say is that this period has also aligned with a period of mass prosperity. Actually, the standards of living for even the poorest have become much, much better than they were before. Certainly in the West, but actually even globally, the poorest, we are actually reducing poverty and raising living standards.
How I would respond to that is not because of distribution of wealth. That is because of the influx of technology. So different technologies have affected ways of life.
Sure.
So the smartphone is a good example. There are people with smartphones in areas where there is abject poverty. So people are afflicted with poverty, but a man may have a smartphone which will change some aspects of his living standards. Where on a smartphone he can make contact with people across the world and have something dispatched to him by way of mail or whatever. Technology has changed the living standards, not distribution of wealth. They have the trickling down effect,
For sure.
Adam Smith standard, but the trickling down is not so, meaning the drops are not so big as they make it out to be.
Agreed with that. And I want to talk about socialism because that's, I think, the other fascinating corridor to go down here. But I want to come back to this because I've been thinking about this 1971 decoupling thing, and I agree with you that there's been this massive burgeoning debt and this income inequality, and a lot of dodgy stuff has happened, frankly, since then. But the same question arises, which is that, okay, we kind of are saying that we don't want the existing form of how money is created, which is in the hands of private banks and central banks, but primarily private banks, fine, accept that. But what's the alternative?
The alternative, of course, we as Muslims will advocate the Khilafah as an alternative, but of course for the Western world that's not an alternative. But what as Muslims we are doing is pointing out the faults in the system and presenting Islam as an alternative. Islam as not as a political system. Islam is never a political party. You don't go to the ballot box and vote Islam. Islam is a way of life. So we're advocating a way of life. And the way of life is Islam as opposed to a capitalist way of life. So the alternative is presenting Islam to people as a creed, as a aqidah, in Tawheed of Allah. Start from Tawheed of Allah, because essentially these issues go back to spirituality. How? I'll bring it back to spirituality. Inni ja'ilun fil ardi khalifa. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, I am making on the earth a khalifa, a representative for the earth. What does that entail? The plunder of resources should not be done by the Khalifa. The distribution of wealth should be carried out by the Khalifa. And some of the Salaf, they mentioned the task of the Khalifa is to mint the coins, even to make the coins, the gold and silver coins, making sure measurements are correct. So if the task of the leadership is to make the measurements correct, imagine these paper currencies, sukuk, they were known as in the old times. They were prohibited by the Khalifa, meaning paper checks that would be given out as IOUs, and even the pound notes have the bearer must be paid the sum of. So that would be stopped by a Khalifa who adopts Islam as a way of life. So Islam as a way of life, not just as a political system. We can't say Islam is a system. It's a way of life. So the alternative is Islam, but again, this enters, economy goes into the field of philosophy and then theology.
Yeah.
Because Western thought has been affected from Thomas Hobbes to all these various philosophers you read about. They affected the Western mindset.
Yeah,
so David
absolutely.
Hume and Kant and Locke and all these names, and you read their works, they have penetrated the Western mind to the point that Christianity is finished. And what we present now is Islam as an alternative, which has a 1400-year tradition.
So Shaykh, I want to get into the alternative, but let's go down that corridor now, the socialism one, because what you were suggesting was that, I think you were saying that Islam would have a better and fairer distribution of wealth. Is that what you were saying?
Yes, so that does not entail socialism or Marxism or any of that. So if you start from the Communist Manifesto, the strange thing about Karl Marx was he was living in Britain at the time. Whether he even visited a factory to see the working standards, it's not proven. I mean, he wrote about the working class and how the working class were living. The man himself was not from a working class background, and he advocated benefiting the working classes. And then at home I have a book. Trotsky has we would say risala. he has a book on addressing the masses to uprise against governments and whatnot. This is not what Islam advocates.
No.
So for instance, you're a rich landowner.
So Engels, Marx's friend, he was actually a factory owner.
Yes.
And he used to fund Marx.
Yes, that's true. Yeah. And let's say you're a rich landowner or a factory owner in Islam now.
Yeah.
What will happen? The people, the Hisbah, which is the caliph's example of the council or the standards, trading standards, they'll come down. They'll look at the how you are treating your workers. The workers will have huquq, rights. When those workers have a complaint, they go to the qadi. And this is where Islam differs from capitalism and communism. In Western corporate law, how does a standard, and you've been a corporate lawyer, a worker, an employee needs to take his employer to work. It's a complicated method. He needs to go see someone like yourself. You'll have a high standard of a fee,
yeah.
And it's complicated. But in Islam, it's very simple. He goes to the district judge, the qadi, with no cost, and he simply complains. And the qadi will summon the factory owner. And the factory owner, if he has violated some of the huquq of the worker, then those violations, he must make amends. He must pay him, or in some cases could even be flogged. So it's a very simple process. But that is how Islam differs even in its judicial process. So unlike capitalism and communism, where everything is divided from the judiciary system, the judicial system, the economic system, and then you have everything separate. In Islam, no one is above the law of Allah. Even the caliph is not above the law of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So then secondly, you would have to pay your zakat every year. So the capitalist now is living in a... by the way, the corporation will not be an entity.
Yeah.
So if you have Starbucks, like Saudi Arabia now has Starbucks, but the Starbucks is an entity.
Yeah.
And Saudi Arabia is not any Islamic state.
Yeah.
We don't use the word state because Islam and state are incompatible. So we would say it's not a khilafah. But it's governed by Muslims, but they have Starbucks. Starbucks in Islam should not be dealt with as an entity, Starbucks. It's individuals who own, meaning the shareholders are deemed as people who are responsible for the workers, responsible for the conditions of work. So you won't have what happens with the smartphones in China, where they have to place nets around the factories, and then people are trying to commit suicide because of the working standards.
Oh my God.
And then they jump out the window, so they place nets around the factories so they don't die. People commit suicide in these factories. None of that will exist.
So you're saying, so this is another very interesting point, Shaykh, about limited liability. I think
that's what you guys call it.
Yeah, it's the idea of being on the hook.
Yes.
And so what you're sketching out is that under an Islamic context, we would go back to the era where we didn't have limited liability corporations, and we would have full liability.
Yes.
And you'd be fully on the hook.
Yes.
For things. Now, again, this is a live question that I'm continue to think about. But one argument against that could be that, again, having limited liability gives I get a benefit of two things. One is it allows you to build institutions for the long term, and that don't park with an individual when he dies. And then the second thing is, it correlated with this huge increase in risk taking and productivity, etc., etc.
how I would respond to that is with regard to productivity. In Islam, absolute productivity is never the goal. So that's where like Wahil Halaq in his book, The Impossible State, correctly advocates that Islam is not compatible with the concept of a modern state, because the concept of a modern state and a corporation is growth. In Islam, as I said, it's what we would refer to as the natural order of economy. It's not absolute growth. So therefore, humans are responsible for even corporations, for instance, where corporations undermine
Sure.
everything. So they enter tribal areas and finish off tribes and the way people live. Islam would leave people as they are.
Yeah, makes sense.
And this is why Islam is not desired as a way of life by so many capitalists, even Muslims in places like Pakistan, where they are educated in the West. They cannot understand. They will just simply say, oh, the Maulvi is against modernity. But it's not as simple as modernity and Islam. The answer goes more into ethics and morality and absolute growth. For instance, Islam would not advocate the building of a nuclear bomb. And that shocks so many Pakistanis, because they think having a nuclear weapon is like the best thing Pakistan has because it's a deterrent against India. But let's use logic. India using its nuclear weapons on Pakistan would only harm itself. So even if Pakistan didn't have a nuclear weapon and India dropped a nuclear weapon on Pakistan, the blowback of the air, the environmental damage will all go back onto the Indian population also. So nuclear weapons are something Muslims should never advocate, even as a deterrent. So for instance, the illegal entity of Israel today has a nuclear weapon. We know it has nuclear warheads. No war is waged on it like it was on Saddam Hussein in 2003, and he had no nuclear weapons. But it has nuclear weapons. The Muslims do not need nuclear weapons, because if those Zionists drop nuclear weapons on Palestinians or surrounding areas, the contaminated air will only enter the occupied land, the occupied Palestine. So Islam, from its overarching, its view of the world, has never advocated absolute growth economically or things like nuclear weapons.
Absolute destruction. There's this underlying tension here, where we've got this modern state, right? And this is a very new conception. We didn't really have these a few hundred years ago. And right now, and again, nuclear warfare is an example of this, where the people who are not following the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, let's say, are behaving in a certain way. And this world is a small place. And if they're not following the rules and they're winning, then if Muslims continue to quote unquote not follow the rules, we could end up just falling way behind. Do you see what I'm getting at? So what I'm saying is, like, let's say they've decided actually the interest-based system, capitalist system, growth at all costs, they've streaked far ahead, hegemony of, let's say, the West or whoever, and Muslims are no, we're not going to do this. In 100 years' time, there's just such a disparity.
See, again, we go back to that this concept of we are going to get left behind. But let's examine what are we going to be left behind in. We've had the Industrial Revolution, and then China is emulating the Industrial Revolution by damaging the environment, exploiting workers, just pure capitalism.
Agreed.
And India is attempting the same. Let's look at the Western model and what it has achieved. Why do we have the environmental damage that we have today? Why do we have the proliferation of nuclear weapons? Are we behind? Are we actually behind? Did Muslims invent mustard gas, the different types of gases that kill millions of people? Did Muslims invent all these various chemicals that were utilized even by Saddam Hussein to kill Iranians? The answer is no. So we are not left behind. What we are left behind in is barbarity. So what capitalism has brought to the world is absolute barbarity and exploitation. people need a reality check when they come out of their town city centres. We come out of Birmingham town city centre, we leave London town city centre, we take a flight to Malawi, we see underdevelopment, real underdevelopment. We see authoritarianism, where governments are authoritarian over those people, Western-backed governments, people who have military power, military capability given to them by Western corporations. So like the way Britain exported its weapons to Yemen, to Saudi Arabia to use on Yemen. So Saudi Arabia buying one of the largest purchases of Western weaponry to use on whom?
Yemenis.
To Yemenis and their own population. The point is that we are not backwards, even if we remain in a simple lifestyle of camels and dates. Those people are better off than the Western capitalism that we have today. And that is where the issue is a spiritual issue. It goes down to actual spirituality. That
what is good?
What is good and what is bad. Meaning what is bad is profiteering to the point that you have plunder of those countries, and then the displacing of populations, the construction of dams which remove entire populations that have been settled in those areas for hundreds of years, thousands of years. Environmental damage, where the growth of the desert, because people are over farming due to paying back debts. So there is this concept you have in some egalitarian Pakistani people as well. In Pakistan, they think that if Pakistan becomes backwards in terms of not modeling itself on the modern state, then we are left behind. I would say no, if we worked on preserving the environment and natural economies, which is what people have at first hand. Natural economy would entail not measuring economic growth through these concepts of GDP. GDP is actually just looking at statistics and numbers, looking at it from what Sayyiduna Ali radiallahu anh said, that if people do not produce their own food, their own clothing, then they are a lost, meaning this nation is doomed to fail. So we should be looking at from the aspect of the standard. See, I could use the word citizen, even the word citizen is for the state, but from the standard of the average person, that is he receiving enough food and clothing and these type of things.
Fascinating. So Sheikh, in a way, I think what you're arguing for is to say that rather than playing the dirty game that is being played, we need to play the game that is ethical, and actually it's a war of ideas, really, because the way to get other people to stop doing what they're doing is not to play the same game and be more powerful than them and overcome them from might, but actually it's the game of ideas, and that's how you change them.
Absolutely. So that's why I refer to it as the intellectual intifada. It's an intifada, but it's intellectual. And just to add to that, Muslims in these areas, for instance, becoming capitalists, their father or grandfather may have bought 2 homes or 3 homes, and now what they are doing, placing those homes under HMOs. They move out to better affluent areas, and they leave behind drug addicts in those homes. But they capitalize. So the government pays out, I don't know how much money the government pays. Sure. They capitalize, they live in other areas. They have no concern about the new communities that are being formed in these areas. There's no concern, because that is the mindset has become like the host people, the host country. That's on a micro level. So now let's take that to a macro level of world economy. If on a micro level we can become capitalists who just look for their own gain, with no concern for the community, no concern for humans, no concern for environment, no concern for actual real things, then on a macro level we become like this also. So countries like Dubai, who advocate that they have sophisticated themselves, they have no technology of their own. They import all Western technology to construct Dubai. The Dubai people themselves cannot construct the cities that they've constructed, and even then they are being scammed, because the largest tower in the world, Burj Khalifa, doesn't even have a drainage and gutter system, and every day hundreds of Indian and Pakistani and Bengali workers have to come and take tons and tons of excrement out. So those capitalists living in the buildings are doing excrement on a daily basis, and then the working people who are treated like slaves are taking tons and tons of excrement and taking it out to the deserts, because these capitalists who are running the country could not even build a decent drainage system with all the millions that they have. That's the world that we live in. That's the reality. It's like having excrement covered with a nice piece of cloth. So you go into the depth of it, it's rubbish. London City, fine example. Outwardly, everyone is capitalizing and making so much money, but go into the depths of London City and you'll find it's one of the most toxic places in the world, meaning how many thousands of homeless people, how many murders and how many killings and drug addicts and all these problems. So it's an ethical and moral problem.
No, I agree with that, Sheikh. Sheikh, I wanted to wrap up with something else, but I want to dig into this idea of the state a little bit more, because I was listening to a podcast by a guy called Balaji, who talks about, he's a founder of Coinbase, so you might not like him because he founded a cryptocurrency brokerage company. But anyway, he's a very bright guy. He's a professor now somewhere. And he postulates this network state, because he says that the nation state is fragmenting and breaking off, because before you had people coagulating around geographies, and then you had a government, and you had the might of that government that makes it all happen. However, now we've got social media, we've got the digital age, and actually people spend most of the time in the digital space, and they find each other independent of the geography. So they might hang out actually the majority of the time in these online communities, and they might then start saying, actually, we want to move to a certain area where all of us are moving, and that's where you see these new communities forming around certain ideas. And so and I'm butchering his overall thesis, but the thrust of the thesis is that the networks, the nation state, it's probably on its way out, and you're going to have some new thing that's going to end up replacing it. I'd love to hear your reaction to that, and also your proposal for what is an Islamic equivalent. I won't call it a state, because I presume that's not the right thing to call it, but what is the Islamic equivalent?
So what you are referring to is an evolutionary process. So even with money, for instance, we've had people moving from metal to the current system, and then from the current system to digital currency. It seems like an evolutionary process. The nation state was born out of empire, ancient empires, and then from what we have now, people want world government. So for nation states becoming world governments, you have the EU, and then you have NAFTA and all these various coalitions. So what some researchers presume is that the world is entering the phase of world government, and what he's stating is that it's being affected, from what I hear from you, that it's being affected by social media, which will lead to something else.
I think he's saying that you're going to have like a complete disregard of, let's say, the USA, China, India, Pakistan, whatever, and you're going to have people who really care about, I don't know, they're really like liberal, for example, and they will just say, okay, we're going to buy some plot of land in Texas, and we're all going to move there.
Well, the way nation states function is that they'll clamp down on that and place some type of laws and limitations. So it may be cut away at the roots from before it even begins. But for Islam as an alternative, again, it goes back to the foundational core is aqeedah, belief. And what I mean by that is tawheed of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and actual spirituality, real spirituality, what we refer to as tasawwuf, but embodying tasawwuf, embodying dhikrullah, embodying tawheed of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and then the risala of the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alayhi wasallam in terms of the sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam. That is the actual solution. How will Muslims move from the current nation-state model to something else, meaning the caliphate or the return of the caliphate? That is something yet to be seen. and something inshallah that in the future generations will see inshallah ta'ala.
Inshallah. Shaykh, I want to wrap up. What's your thoughts about the future, and what's your advice to people listening, to me, to us, to all of us, in terms of how we can do what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants?
So embodying something known as ubudiyah. What is ubudiyah? Servitude to Allah. So as a slave of Allah, the earth is the banquet of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And I am the slave of Allah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has guaranteed me my rizq. I was born naked and I have clothes. Meaning at the time of my birth, I didn't plan to have clothes, but Allah gave me clothes. So rizq is something guaranteed. Rather than running after what is guaranteed in a way that we become covetous for wealth and material gain, let's realize our ubudiyah, servitude to Allah. When we realize our ubudiyah, servitude to Allah, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will also give us material success. Like the Sultan Muhammad al-Fatih, when he conquered Constantinople, he constructed a citadel, which if you look at in terms of secular point of view, that citadel could not have been constructed within that time frame that he actually constructed that citadel. It was only done because he realized his ubudiyah, servitude to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Today people talk about Islam being victorious or Islam being materialistically successful, but they don't talk about how those Muslims they had realized their ubudiyah, servitude to Allah. Imagine the likes of Abu Ubaidah bin al-Jarrah radiallahu anhu, the conqueror of Syria, who only had one pair of clothes. He conquered Syria, the whole of Syro-Palestine, and then he would be absent one day a week. And the people complained and they said to Sayyidina Umar radiallahu anhu, your governor is here 6 days a week, he's absent one day. So Sayyidina Umar went to see him. And he said, yes, on the 7th day, I only have one pair of clothes and I wash it and I leave it to hang to dry. And then I cannot go out.
Allahu Akbar.
So these were the type of people who carried out the conquest, not people who were out there to conquer the world for material gain. But at the same time, they distributed wealth and they carried out social justice. So young people who were ideologically charged with ISIS, they didn't carry out social justice. They didn't carry out how Islam should be embodied. When they imprisoned people and placing them in cages, none of this is established in Islam. Sayyidina Abu Bakr Siddiq radiallahu anh even prohibited the display of decapitated heads. It's prohibited. It's in the Sunan of Al-Bayhaqi. So embodying our servitude is basing our lives on the way of the companions alayhim ridwan, our worldview. It's what some have called a Quranic worldview, but it's greater than that because it has the sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So embodying Islam like the companions alayhim ridwan.
Barakallahu feek, Shaykh. This has been a real pleasure. I've learnt a lot. I've really enjoyed it, and I hope you two have also enjoyed it. If you'd like to give your thoughts, your comments, your questions perhaps for the Shaykh, and we can come back, inshallah, make pilgrimage to Birmingham once more and sit with the Shaykh and get those questions answered as well. Barakallahu feek, Shaykh. It's been a real pleasure.
Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.